Former Chief Petty Officer Dylan Cross had retired from the Navy SEALs 14 months ago after serving 16 years, leaving not because of physical injury, but because of something potentially worse. Burnout so psychologically complete he couldn't trust his judgment anymore during operational decision-making. At 37 years old, Dylan walked away from a career at its peak because he recognized something breaking inside him that could get teammates killed. His final mission in Mogadishu, Somalia, involved a hostage rescue operation where Dylan hesitated during breach entry, second-guessing intelligence that ultimately turned out to be accurate. The 2-second delay didn't cost lives. The mission succeeded with all hostages recovered safely. But Dylan knew he'd frozen when decisiveness mattered most. No one else noticed the hesitation in the chaos of the breach. Dylan noticed. He recognized the symptom of something fundamental breaking in his operational psychology. Research showed that burnout among military personnel manifested as reduced effectiveness, fatigue, indifference, and impaired decision-making under stress. Dylan requested retirement before his compromised judgment killed someone, and the Navy granted it with full honors and genuine confusion about why a decorated operator with an exemplary record would voluntarily walk away from a career trajectory pointing toward senior leadership positions. For 14 months, Dylan had drifted through civilian life in Virginia Beach, exhibiting classic symptoms of identity loss following military transition, working security consulting contracts that bored him intellectually, attending social events he left early without explanation, dating women he didn't call back because forming connections required emotional investment he couldn't access. His apartment was meticulously organized with military precision, but emotionally empty. No photographs from deployments, no SEAL memorabilia, nothing that reminded him he used to be someone who mattered and had purpose beyond just existing. His VA therapist diagnosed what she called existential drift following identity loss, a specific pattern seen in combat veterans who retired voluntarily rather than through injury, where absence of physical disability created absence of tangible reason for career ending, leaving psychological void. Dylan thought the diagnosis was clinical terminology for what he experienced more simply. He was just empty, running on muscle memory and ingrained routine, because purpose died somewhere in that Mogadishu safe house when he realized his judgment was broken. PTSD symptoms in veterans commonly included hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, severe anxiety, and detachment from others. Dylan exhibited all symptoms despite never being formally diagnosed with PTSD, because his retirement paperwork showed no combat trauma, just voluntary separation. What made Dylan's drift particularly hollow was that he'd completed his entire SEAL career without a K-9 partner. He'd trained extensively with military working dogs, respected them professionally, understood their capabilities and limitations, but never deployed with one operationally. His specialization was close-quarters combat and urban operations that didn't require K-9 support. Now, in civilian aimlessness, he found himself wondering if partnership with a working dog might have anchored him differently, given him something beyond mission completion to care about, provided purpose that transcended tactical success. Dylan's sister Emma, a veterinary technician at Hampton Roads Animal Shelter, who'd been watching her brother's psychological deterioration with increasing alarm, had been trying to pull him out of isolation for months with escalating desperation. Her latest attempt came during a Sunday dinner Dylan attended purely out of obligation. "We need volunteers at the shelter," Emma said, with practiced casualness. "Just an hour a week. You sit with dogs that need socialization before adoption. That's literally it. No commitment beyond showing up." Dylan tried to decline with vague excuses about being busy, but Emma added the detail she knew would hook him. "We have a military working dog, 4 years old, washed out of Marine Corps training for severe aggression issues. He's been with us for 6 months. We can't place him, can't rehabilitate him using standard protocols, and he's scheduled for euthanasia in 10 days. His name is Havoc. I thought maybe someone with military background might understand him before we give up." The implication was clear without being explicitly stated. There was a warrior dog about to be killed because the military system broke him during training, and no one knew how to fix what they'd created. Dylan agreed to one visit, not because he cared about volunteering or believed he could help, but because the idea of a warrior being discarded for damage inflicted during training resonated viscerally with his own sense of being fundamentally broken by service. On a Saturday afternoon, when Virginia Beach weather was perfect, and Dylan felt particularly hollow by contrast, he drove to Hampton Roads Animal Shelter, expecting to go through motions mechanically and leave unchanged. Emma met him at the entrance and explained the volunteer protocol with practiced patience. "We bring dogs to the socialization room one at a time. You interact however feels natural. If there's genuine connection, that's wonderful. If not, absolutely no pressure. These dogs just need human presence without demands or expectations." Dylan followed her to a small room containing only a bench, water bowl, and nothing else. Emma brought 3 dogs first: a pit bull mix with separation anxiety, a German shepherd with fear of men stemming from abuse, a Labrador recovering from neglect. All were undeniably good dogs with fixable behavioral issues. Dylan petted them mechanically, feeling nothing beyond surface observation, reinforcing his belief that he was too emotionally empty to help anyone or anything. Then Emma returned with a warning that changed her tone completely. "This is Havoc, Belgian Malinois, 4 years old. He washed out of Marine Corps MWD training after biting 3 handlers and destroying 2 training facilities during aggressive episodes. He's been with us for 6 months, and his behavior has deteriorated rather than improved. Reactive to all environmental stimuli, aggressive towards staff who approach, can't be near other animals without extreme violence. We're euthanizing him in 10 days because we've exhausted every rehabilitation option available. But I thought, before we give up, maybe someone who understands what military training does to dogs might see something we're missing." When they brought Havoc into the room, Dylan immediately understood why euthanasia was being seriously considered. Havoc entered muzzled for safety, led by 2 handlers using control poles for distance management, body coiled with barely contained violence. The Belgian Malinois was approximately 65 pounds of pure focused aggression, muscles rigid with tension, eyes tracking every movement with predatory tactical focus, teeth visible behind the muzzle in warning display, pulling against restraint with intensity suggesting he was constantly in fight or flight mode. This wasn't a dog with behavioral problems requiring training adjustment. This was a dog whose training environment broke something fundamental in his psychology, and now he couldn't distinguish between genuine threats and normal existence. The handlers carefully removed Havoc's muzzle using a specialized quick-release mechanism that allowed rapid exit, then retreated quickly and locked the door for safety. The Belgian Malinois immediately moved to the corner farthest from Dylan, defensive positioning, maintaining maximum distance, growling continuously with low, focused intensity. Emma's voice came through the observation window intercom. "Don't approach him. Don't make direct eye contact. That's threatening. Just exist in the space. 5 minutes, then we extract him safely. This is just to see if he shows any different behavior with someone who has military background." Dylan sat on the bench, hands visible and non-threatening, making absolutely no sudden movements. He recognized this behavior, not from dogs specifically, but from operators he'd worked with who experienced severe psychological trauma. The hypervigilance, the defensive aggression, the complete inability to differentiate between safe and dangerous situations because trauma fundamentally rewired their threat assessment systems. Havoc wasn't aggressive because he was a bad dog or poorly bred. He was aggressive because his training environment taught him that everything represented a threat and violence was the only appropriate survival response. Dylan didn't try to train, command, or rehabilitate. He just spoke honestly, voice quiet and resigned. "Yeah, I understand completely. They put you in a room with a stranger, removed your muzzle, and expect you to be calm. Except your body is screaming that this is a threat scenario and you need to attack or defend immediately. I know that feeling intimately. I wake up every morning and my brain runs through threat assessments for a civilian apartment that doesn't contain any actual threats. We're both stuck in combat mode with no combat to justify it." Dylan continued, not performing for observers but processing aloud for himself. "They say you're too aggressive to place anywhere. Probably because you learned during training that aggression is how you survive when scenarios get out of control or handlers use excessive force. I've seen MWD training environments. Some of it crosses ethical lines. You probably crossed back and they labeled you defective for defending yourself. Fair assessment. I'm defective too. Couldn't trust my judgment anymore during operations, so I quit before I got someone killed. But here's the thing. I'm not going to hurt you or demand anything from you. I'm just sitting here, as empty and broken as you are, waiting for this to be over, so we can both go back to waiting for whatever comes next." What happened next shocked everyone watching through the observation window. Havoc stopped growling completely. The Belgian Malinois' body language shifted dramatically from defensive aggression to something entirely different: confusion, cautious assessment, curiosity. Havoc took 3 tentative steps toward Dylan, then 4 more deliberate steps. Then he was standing 8 feet away, head tilted, studying this human who smelled like resignation and emptiness, but wasn't acting like a threat. Dylan didn't extend his hand or invite approach. He just sat with hands resting on his knees, existing without agenda or expectation. Havoc approached slowly and carefully, sniffed Dylan's boots thoroughly, then his hands. Then, in a movement that made Emma gasp audibly through the intercom, the Belgian Malinois lay down at Dylan's feet, placed his head on Dylan's boot, and closed his eyes. Not sleep, but genuine rest, submission without coercion, trust without force. 2 beings broken by systems they served, recognizing each other across the gap between species and understanding that sometimes the most aggressive-looking survivors are just the most honest about being unable to cope with existence anymore. Emma entered the room slowly and carefully, expecting Havoc to react with his typical aggression toward any movement. The Belgian Malinois raised his head, but didn't move from Dylan's feet, didn't growl, just watched with eyes that looked measurably less wild than they had 5 minutes earlier. I've literally never seen him calm with anyone in 6 months, Emma said, genuine shock evident in her voice. What did you do? Dylan's answer was simple and raw. Nothing special. I just told him I understood what it's like when the world feels like constant threat and you don't know how to stop fighting even though there's nothing to fight anymore. Emma made an offer that terrified Dylan more than any combat operation he'd conducted. He's scheduled for euthanasia in exactly 10 days. We absolutely cannot place him. He's far too reactive for any adoption scenario we can imagine. But if you wanted to foster him for those 10 days, give him somewhere besides a kennel before we put him down. Maybe someone who genuinely gets him could show us something that changes the outcome. Dylan's immediate response was refusal. I don't know anything about rehabilitating aggressive dogs. I've never even owned a pet. I can't save him. But Emma countered with logic Dylan couldn't easily dismiss. You calmed him in 5 minutes when 6 months of professional intervention by experienced handlers completely failed. Maybe he doesn't need saving through rehabilitation protocols. Maybe he just needs someone who isn't afraid of his aggression because they understand it's just survival instinct that doesn't have an off switch. Dylan looked down at Havoc, still resting with his head on Dylan's boot like it was the first safe place he'd found in 6 months of shelter confinement. Against every logical objection, driven by recognition of shared brokenness and the ghost of purposelessness he'd been carrying for 14 months, Dylan said, 1 week. If he's dangerous toward me or I genuinely can't handle it safely, he comes back immediately and you proceed with euthanasia. I'm not giving him false hope of permanent placement. I'm just giving him somewhere different to be for his final week. Bringing Havoc home transformed Dylan's existence in ways that bypassed logic and operated purely on instinct. The Belgian Malinois was intensely reactive to everything in the environment, barked aggressively at neighbors, lunged at windows when cars passed, exhibited hypervigilance that physically exhausted both of them. But Havoc never showed any aggression toward Dylan. Not when Dylan forgot to feed him on schedule. Not when Dylan moved suddenly. Not when Dylan had nightmares about Somalia that woke them both at 300 hours screaming. Instead, Havoc positioned himself protectively, lying beside Dylan's bed at night, maintaining vigilant watch, following him from room to room, maintaining defensive proximity, alert barking at sounds that might represent threats. Dylan recognized the behavior because he exhibited similar patterns himself. Hypervigilance in parking lots, assessing threats, defensive positioning in restaurants, maintaining visual on exits, complete inability to relax because relaxation meant lowered threat awareness that could be fatal. Havoc wasn't being aggressive toward Dylan. He was protecting someone he'd decided was vulnerable and mattered. Dylan began working with Havoc using techniques he'd learned observing MWD handlers during his career. Calm commands, absolutely consistent routines, rewarding relaxation rather than punishing reactive behavior. Progress was incremental and non-linear. Havoc still barked at strangers approaching, still showed teeth when surprised by sudden movements or sounds. But with Dylan specifically, the Belgian Malinois was fundamentally different, patient, attentive, almost therapeutic in his constant presence. 4 days into fostering, something shifted dramatically. Dylan was having a severe anxiety attack, the kind that had been increasing in frequency since retirement, where his body convinced him he was in active combat when he was actually sitting safely in his living room. Heart racing violently, breathing shallow and rapid, vision tunneling, convinced threat was imminent, even though logically he knew he was safe in his apartment. Dylan sat on his couch, trying desperately to control breathing using techniques his therapist taught him. Havoc did something completely unexpected and untrained. The Belgian Malinois jumped onto the couch, violating every boundary they'd established about furniture, placed his full weight against Dylan's chest, and made sustained direct eye contact while applying deep pressure. The pressure was profoundly grounding. The eye contact forced Dylan's brain to focus on something immediate and present rather than phantom threats. After approximately 90 seconds, Dylan's breathing normalized. His heart rate decreased measurably. The panic subsided. Havoc wasn't trained for psychiatric service work. The Belgian Malinois had simply recognized Dylan was in acute distress and solved the problem using his body and presence as therapeutic tools. Over the following days, Havoc began exhibiting more psychiatric support behaviors without any formal training. Waking Dylan from nightmares, interrupting anxiety spirals before they escalated, providing deep pressure therapy during panic attacks. It was as if the Belgian Malinois was systematically identifying Dylan's psychological breaks and compensating for them. Not from instruction, but from partnership forged in mutual recognition of trauma. The turning point came on day 7, the day immediately before Havoc's scheduled euthanasia appointment. Emma called with news that changed everything. A Marine K-9 handler contacted us after hearing about Havoc through veteran networks. He wants to meet him, says he's worked with reactive MWDs for over a decade, and thinks he can place Havoc with a veteran who needs psychiatric service dog support. But he needs to assess Havoc's trainability first. Can you bring him to the shelter tomorrow morning? Dylan's first reaction was relief. Havoc might live, might find purpose, might escape euthanasia. But his second reaction was grief so profound, it shocked him. He didn't want to give Havoc up. The Belgian Malinois had become the first thing in 14 months that made Dylan feel something beyond emptiness. The partnership that formed in 7 days had filled psychological space Dylan didn't realize was hollow until something finally occupied it. The assessment happened the next morning at the shelter. The Marine handler, Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Webb, experienced with over a decade of MWD operational and rehabilitation work, arrived expecting to evaluate a dangerous, reactive dog with potential for psychiatric service placement. Instead, he found Havoc sitting calmly at Dylan's side, alert but controlled, exhibiting none of the aggressive reactivity documented in shelter records. Marcus ran Havoc through basic obedience commands: sit, stay, heel, down. Havoc performed adequately, but kept checking on Dylan's location constantly, refusing to fully engage with Marcus as handler. Then Marcus asked Dylan to leave the room completely to assess how Havoc responded to handler absence, a critical test for service dog placement. The moment Dylan exited, Havoc's behavior deteriorated catastrophically, barking frantically, lunging at the door, reverting instantly to the aggressive reactivity that had defined his 6 months at the shelter. Marcus called Dylan back in immediately for safety. Havoc calmed instantly upon Dylan's return. Marcus's assessment was direct and definitive. This dog isn't suitable for placement with another veteran. He's bonded to you specifically at psychological level that supersedes training. His reactivity isn't general behavioral problem. It's separation anxiety and protective instinct focused exclusively on you. You're not fostering him temporarily. You're his handler permanently. He's chosen you. Dylan tried to explain he wasn't equipped. No experience with dog ownership, no understanding of long-term care requirements, no mental health stability to be responsible for another being's welfare. But Marcus cut through the objections decisively. Sir, I've worked with reactive MWDs for 12 years operationally and in rehabilitation. What I just witnessed isn't a broken dog requiring fixing. It's a dog who found his person and will do whatever it takes to stay with that person. He's providing you psychiatric support instinctively without training. That's not learned behavior. That's partnership. The question isn't whether you can handle him. It's whether you're willing to let him handle you. Emma, who'd been watching the assessment, added the detail that broke Dylan's resistance. He calms you. I've watched you this week when you bring him for walks. You're measurably less hollow, less empty. He didn't just find safety with you. You found purpose with him. Maybe that's what both of you needed. Something to protect, something to matter to, something beyond yourselves. Dylan adopted Havoc that afternoon, 30 minutes before the scheduled euthanasia appointment. The paperwork officially listed Dylan as handler for a military working dog washout with severe documented aggression issues. The reality was more complex. Dylan was a retired SEAL whose judgment broke finding partnership with a Belgian Malinois whose trust broke. And together they were learning that being broken didn't mean being done. It just meant requiring different definitions of strength and success. 6 months after adopting Havoc, Dylan's apartment reflected visible transformation. Walls that had been emotionally empty now held photographs from SEAL deployments, not as shrine to what he'd lost, but as tangible evidence of identity that still existed despite self-doubt. Havoc's presence had forced beneficial routine into Dylan's existence. Morning walks providing structure, regular feeding schedules creating responsibility, training sessions giving both mental stimulation and shared purpose. Dylan had stopped drifting aimlessly through contracts and started building intentionally. He'd launched a consulting business focused specifically on veteran transition support, using his experience with purposelessness to help others navigate similar psychological darkness. Havoc's reactivity had decreased significantly, but never fully disappeared. He remained alert to environmental threats, still protective of Dylan, still exhibited hypervigilance in unfamiliar environments. But the severe aggression that made him unadoptable had transformed into controlled protectiveness that was manageable. Dylan worked with a professional trainer specializing in reactive dogs, learning that rehabilitation wasn't about eliminating the behavior entirely, but managing it through understanding its psychological source. Dylan and Havoc began volunteering regularly at Hampton Roads Animal Shelter, working specifically with reactive and aggressive dogs that staff struggled to socialize safely. Dylan's methods were deliberately unorthodox. He didn't force interaction or use dominance-based training protocols. He simply existed in spaces with damaged dogs, speaking honestly about his own struggles with emptiness and purposelessness. His understanding that aggression was often just fear, manifesting as control when everything felt dangerously out of control. Dogs that experienced handlers couldn't manage began showing measurable progress with Dylan, not because he trained them differently using special techniques, but because he related to them from authentic shared brokenness rather than clinical objectivity. Dylan also began facilitating peer support groups for transitioning veterans through the VA, bringing Havoc to all sessions. The Belgian Malinois' presence, his visible reactivity, his obvious trauma history, his clear bond with Dylan despite mutual damage, became powerful teaching tool for veterans struggling with purpose loss following military separation. Havoc was supposed to be euthanized because training broke him and no one knew how to fix what they created, Dylan told one support group. I was supposed to drift through life because I couldn't trust myself anymore during operations. We found each other not because either of us was fixed or healed, but because we stopped pretending we needed to be fixed before we could matter to someone. Partnership doesn't require perfection, just honest recognition of shared struggle. 1 year after that shocking moment in the shelter, Dylan received official certification as Psychiatric Service Dog Handler, with Havoc formally registered as his service animal for anxiety and PTSD support. The Belgian Malinois, who was too aggressive to adopt, had become the dog whose instinctive support kept Dylan functional during episodes that would otherwise be psychologically debilitating. Dylan began training other transitioning veterans in recognizing psychiatric service dog potential in reactive rescue dogs, creating partnerships where mutual trauma became foundation for mutual support. 2 years after visiting the shelter, Dylan and Havoc participated in a national conference on military working dog rehabilitation, demonstrating how trauma-informed handling could transform supposedly irredeemable aggression into managed protectiveness. When conference attendees asked how Dylan rehabilitated such a dangerous dog, his answer challenged traditional training paradigms fundamentally. I didn't rehabilitate him through training protocols. I stopped treating his aggression like a behavioral defect and started treating it like a trauma response from training environment that broke his trust systematically. Havoc was aggressive because his environment taught him that's how you survive when everything hurts you. I was psychologically empty because my judgment broke during operations and I couldn't trust myself anymore. We didn't fix each other through therapy or training. We just acknowledged that being broken doesn't disqualify meaningful partnership. Everything else, the psychiatric service work, the reduced reactivity, the purpose, that happened because neither of us had to pretend we were okay when we weren't. The demonstration included Dylan walking on stage with Havoc maintaining controlled heel position, showing the transformation from shelter aggression to functional partnership. 3 years after meeting Havoc, Dylan co-founded a non-profit organization called Broken Together, specifically pairing transitioning veterans struggling with purpose loss with reactive military working dog washouts, creating partnerships where mutual damage became foundation for healing. The organization's mission statement, written by Dylan, reflected his philosophy. Perfect mental health isn't required for meaningful partnership. Perfect understanding of shared struggle is. We pair veterans whose purpose broke with dogs whose trust broke. Together, they prove that brokenness doesn't mean worthless. It just means honest about damage others pretend doesn't exist. Dylan also became a sought-after speaker at veteran transition conferences, sharing his story of voluntary retirement due to burnout and subsequent discovery of purpose through unexpected partnership. I retired because I couldn't trust my judgment during operations anymore, he told one audience. For 14 months, I drifted through civilian life completely hollow. Then I met a dog everyone said was too dangerous to save. We recognized each other across species, 2 warriors broken by service, unable to cope with existence. That recognition didn't cure my burnout or fix his aggression, but it reminded me that purpose isn't found in perfect execution or flawless judgment. It's found in willingness to show up for something that needs you, even when you're convinced you have nothing to offer. 4 years after that initial shelter visit, Dylan received an award from the Military Working Dog Foundation for outstanding contribution to MWD welfare and veteran transition support. During his acceptance speech, he was asked the question that captured everything. What did the aggressive K9 do next that shocked everyone? Dylan's answer became the foundation of a documentary about veteran MWD partnerships. Havoc lay down at my feet and chose to trust me when every experience taught him humans were dangerous. That choice, to trust despite trauma, shocked everyone watching because we expect broken things to stay broken permanently. We expect aggression to be permanent personality flaw. We expect burnout to be permanent disqualification from purpose. Havoc proved that brokenness is just a starting point, not a destination. Together, we learned the most important lesson. Warriors don't stop being warriors when their judgment breaks or their minds carry trauma. They just find different ways to serve, different partners who need them, and different battles where presence matters more than perfection. Being broken together is infinitely stronger than being perfect alone. The former SEAL who retired because he couldn't trust his judgment anymore discovered that the most important decisions don't come from perfect judgment. They come from recognizing when something matters enough to override fear of failure. What the aggressive Belgian Malinois did next didn't just shock the shelter staff. It shocked Dylan into understanding that purpose isn't found in perfect execution, flawless judgment, or operational success. It's found in willingness to show up for something that desperately needs you, even when you're convinced you have nothing left to offer, and discovering that sometimes being needed is sufficient reason to remember why survival matters beyond just mechanically breathing.